What if everything we thought we knew about the last Russian royal family was wrong? What if the story of their tragic end, a story the world has mourned for more than a century, hid secrets buried so deep it took modern DNA analysis to finally uncover the truth? For decades, the Romanovs were ghosts of history, a family remembered through faded photographs, diary pages, and the chilling echo of gunfire in a dark basement in Yekaterinburg. But when scientists began to dig, literally and genetically, into the mystery of what really happened to Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, what they found changed everything. It revealed not only the brutal final chapter of the Russian Empire, but also how science, faith, and politics collided in a way no one could have predicted. This is the story of how DNA analysis finally solved the Romanov mystery and why the truth is far more disturbing than anyone imagined. To understand what happened, we need to go back to July 17, 1918. The Russian Revolution had torn the empire apart. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, had abdicated more than a year earlier, and his family was held captive by the Bolsheviks. In the early hours of that July morning, guards led the family, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and a few loyal servants, into a small basement room. They were told they would soon be moved for their safety, but what followed was not protection, it was execution. Gunfire erupted, the room filled with smoke and screams. In minutes, the Romanovs, the dynasty that had ruled Russia for more than 300 years, were gone. Their bodies were loaded onto trucks, dumped into shallow graves, and hidden beneath layers of acid and dirt. The new Soviet government announced their deaths, but confusion spread quickly. Some reports claimed only Nicholas had been executed and that the rest of the family was alive. Others whispered that one or more of the children had escaped, and that was how the legend of Anastasia began. For years, imposters appeared across Europe, women claiming to be the lost Grand Duchess Anastasia. Some had scars, memories, or stories that seemed hauntingly real. One woman, Anna Anderson, became famous for insisting she was Anastasia Romanova herself. Her story captured the world's imagination, inspiring films, books, and decades of speculation. Could it be that the youngest daughter of the Tsar had survived the massacre? The mystery deepened in 1979, when 2 amateur archaeologists discovered a mass grave near Yekaterinburg. Inside were skeletal remains, badly damaged, incomplete, but unmistakably human. Yet the discovery was kept secret for nearly a decade, hidden during the Soviet era when such matters were politically dangerous. When the grave was finally opened in 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, scientists began the painstaking process of analyzing the bones. At first, they found 9 sets of remains, enough for the Tsar, the Tsarina, 3 of their daughters, and 4 servants. But that left 2 members of the family missing. Where were Alexei, the Tsarevich, and one of his sisters, believed to be either Maria or Anastasia? The missing bodies reignited the old myth. Maybe Anastasia had escaped after all. Maybe she was still out there. Or her descendants were. The world watched as forensic experts and geneticists worked to answer the question once and for all. It was a race between history and science. Using DNA from living relatives, descendants of Queen Victoria, including Prince Philip, the late Duke of Edinburgh, scientists compared the genetic material from the Yekaterinburg remains. The results were shocking. Mitochondrial DNA, which passes unchanged from mother to child, confirmed that the remains belonged to the Romanovs. Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters had been found. But the mystery of the missing 2 persisted. Years later, in 2007, another excavation near the original burial site unearthed a smaller separate grave. Inside were charred bone fragments belonging to 2 individuals, one a young boy, the other a young girl. Their ages matched Alexei and one of his sisters. When those remains were tested, the DNA was an exact match to the Romanov family. Forensic science had finally closed the case. After nearly a century of rumors, imposters, and conspiracy theories, the Romanovs were accounted for, all 7 of them. The mystery was solved, or so it seemed, because once the DNA results were made public, not everyone accepted them. Some members of the Russian Orthodox Church, and even segments of the Russian population, refused to believe that these bones belonged to the Tsar and his family. They argued that the remains were planted, or that the testing was flawed, or even that the truth was too inconvenient for the state to admit. And that's where the story takes a darker turn, one where politics, religion, and science clashed in a struggle over history itself. Why did so many people refuse to believe what science had proven beyond doubt? Why was the truth so hard to accept? To answer that, we have to understand what the Romanovs represented, not just to Russia, but to the human psyche. They weren't merely rulers. They were symbols of a vanished world. The Romanovs embodied the idea of divine monarchy, an empire blessed by God, now brutally extinguished by revolution. For many Russians, especially those who viewed the Tsar as a martyr or saint, accepting that his body had been found and examined in a lab felt like desecration. The church canonized Nicholas and his family in 2000 as passion bearers, people who met death with humility and faith. For them, the Romanovs were no longer just historical figures. They were sacred. And so, the DNA evidence became more than science. It became a test of faith. Modern genetics had stripped away the legends, the myths, and the comforting illusions. It told a cold, factual truth. There were no survivors, no hidden princesses, no escape from that terrible basement. It was a truth that ended the romance of mystery and replaced it with the heavy weight of reality. But that truth, as history shows us, was only the beginning of another revelation, one that questioned how far we're willing to go when science collides with our deepest beliefs. Because even as DNA closed the Romanov chapter, it opened a new one that revealed how the story of their deaths wasn't just about a family, but about an entire nation wrestling with its own identity. And what scientists found next in those remains would disturb even the most hardened historians. When scientists began to examine the Romanov remains in greater depth, they weren't just searching for identities anymore. They were uncovering a grim forensic diary of what really happened on that July night in 1918. Every bone, every fragment, told a story that human witnesses could no longer tell. The evidence revealed details that had long been hidden behind myth and political secrecy. The Romanovs hadn't been killed cleanly or swiftly. The gunfire had been chaotic, the room filled with bullets, smoke, and confusion. Bullets ricocheted off walls. Some of the girls, Anastasia, Maria, and Tatiana, had survived the first volley. Their royal jewels, sewn secretly into their corsets for safekeeping, had acted like crude body armor, deflecting the shots. It was only when the executioners realized this that they turned to bayonets. What followed was an unspeakable horror that left even the killers traumatized. Forensic specialists were able to confirm this grim truth by studying bone trauma, shrapnel traces, and bullet wounds. Their analysis aligned precisely with accounts from the Bolshevik guards, who later confessed, reluctantly, to what they had done. It was not a clean execution, it was a massacre. But even as this evidence came to light, the politics surrounding the Romanovs' remains grew increasingly complicated. In 1998, 8 decades after their deaths, the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters were finally laid to rest in St. Petersburg's Peter and Paul Cathedral, the traditional burial place of Russian czars. The ceremony was broadcast across Russia. President Boris Yeltsin delivered a somber eulogy, calling it a day of great repentance. Yet conspicuously, the Russian Orthodox Church refused to attend. To them, the bones in those coffins were not the czars. The church had not recognized the DNA evidence as valid. To this day, parts of the clergy still hold that the true remains have never been found, arguing that science alone cannot authenticate what they believe is sacred truth. And that's the paradox at the heart of the Romanov mystery. Science has given us answers, but belief refuses to let them rest. In the years following the burial, new advances in genetic testing made it possible to reanalyze the remains with greater accuracy. Laboratories in the United States and Europe used mitochondrial DNA sequencing and short tandem repeat STR analysis, cutting-edge methods that can trace ancestry across multiple generations. These tests reaffirmed the earlier conclusions. Every sample matched perfectly. The statistical probability that the remains were not the Romanovs was effectively zero. Even Prince Philip's DNA, drawn from his maternal line as a direct descendant of Tsarina Alexandra's family, matched precisely. The science was irrefutable, but the mystery was far from over. When Russian investigators compared the mitochondrial DNA of the newly found remains, the young boy and girl discovered in 2007, they confirmed these were indeed Alexei and one of his sisters. That should have been the end. The missing puzzle pieces had finally been placed, and yet the Kremlin hesitated to make a final declaration. In 2015, the Russian Orthodox Church requested that all DNA tests be redone under its supervision, citing questions of moral legitimacy. Samples were re-examined by Russian geneticists, again confirming what international scientists had already proven. The remains belonged to the Romanov family, but official recognition lagged. The church announced it would conduct its own investigation, one that continues to this day. Why? Because this story isn't just about the dead, it's about what the living choose to believe. For the church, the Romanovs were not merely victims of political violence, they were saints martyred by an atheist regime. Their bones, therefore, couldn't simply be tested in a lab like any other specimen. To admit that the state's scientists had already found them and handled them was to accept a version of history tied to the very institutions that had once persecuted the faithful. The conflict between scientific truth and spiritual conviction has rarely been so stark. On one side stood geneticists with microscopes, extracting truth from fragments of bone. On the other stood theologians and believers, seeking meaning beyond data and DNA. Both claimed to be searching for the same thing, truth, but each defined it differently. Still, science pressed forward. Geneticists not only identified the Romanovs, but also began to reconstruct their health profiles. By studying mitochondrial mutations and genetic markers, researchers confirmed long-standing rumors about hemophilia, the blood disorder that plagued Tsarevich Alexei. The disease had passed down from Queen Victoria through Alexandra into the boy who was meant to inherit one of the world's largest empires. It was this illness that had made the Romanovs so vulnerable, not just physically but politically. Alexandra's desperation to cure her son had driven her into the influence of Grigory Rasputin, the so-called mad monk whose presence at court helped destroy the family's credibility. Science had now confirmed what history had whispered. Alexei's hemophilia was not legend. It was written in his DNA. There was an eerie poetry in that discovery. The same science that proved the boy's existence also confirmed the flaw that doomed his dynasty. As researchers pieced together these truths, a darker question began to emerge, one that unsettled even the scientists themselves. What does it mean when we can resurrect history not through stories, but through fragments of bone and strands of genetic code? DNA had stripped away the veil of mystery, leaving only facts. Yet in doing so, it also stripped away the magic, the myths that had comforted generations. The story of the lost princess, the secret escape, the hope that one of the Romanovs had survived, that was gone forever. And for some, that loss felt as profound as the tragedy itself. Because humanity doesn't just crave truth, we crave meaning. Science had told us what happened, but it could not tell us why humanity keeps repeating the same cycles of power, faith, and destruction. The Romanov DNA story wasn't just about confirming identities. It was about confronting the cost of knowledge. What happens when we finally uncover every secret we once thought was sacred? As scientists closed the case, the church kept its silence, and Russia itself seemed caught between two worlds. One defined by faith and nostalgia, the other by reason and progress. Yet even as the bones of the Romanovs rested in their marble tombs, new forensic discoveries hinted that this story might still have one more secret left to reveal. Because within the genetic data, within the sequences that defined the Romanovs, researchers found something unexpected. But to the origins of modern genetic science itself, it's strange to think that a story born from such tragedy could also mark the dawn of a scientific revolution. But in a way, the Romanovs were among the first families in history to be reunited, not by history books or eyewitness accounts, but by the language of DNA itself. Their story bridged the past and the future, linking the bloodlines of monarchs to the emerging power of genetic science that would reshape medicine, identity, and even justice in the century to come. After decades of speculation, the final test conducted in 2018 exactly 100 years after their deaths, confirmed beyond any doubt that all 7 Romanovs had been found. The data was precise, the matches conclusive, the results peer-reviewed by independent experts across Russia, the United States, and Europe. Modern sequencing techniques had advanced far beyond those of the early 1990s, enabling scientists to reconstruct full mitochondrial profiles from even degraded bone fragments. It was science at its most powerful, silent, objective, and relentless in its pursuit of truth. And yet the discovery didn't bring the peace many had hoped for. The Romanov family's story had always been more than a historical tragedy. It was a mirror reflecting Russia's own struggle with its past. To some, laying the Romanovs to rest meant closing an old wound. To others, it felt like erasing a part of the soul of the nation, one sanctified by suffering. When the bones were re-examined and confirmed, the Church once again declined to declare them holy relics, stating that faith, not science, must be the final judge. Even today, the debate quietly lingers in Russia's cathedrals and classrooms. Officially, the state recognizes the remains as genuine, but spiritually, the question remains open. The truth, it seems, depends on where one chooses to look, for some in a microscope, for others in the soul. Still, what the Romanov case achieved for science cannot be overstated. It became one of the most pivotal moments in the history of forensic genetics. The same methods used to identify the Tsar's family are now standard in criminal investigations, archaeology, and disaster recovery worldwide. The protocols for mitochondrial DNA sequencing that solved the Romanov case have since helped identify victims of war, plane crashes, and natural disasters. From mass graves in Bosnia to archaeological digs in Peru, the echoes of the Romanov investigation can be found in labs around the world. But there's also a haunting symbolism in that connection. The Romanovs' bloodline, once the emblem of divine right and absolute rule, had, in the end, become the foundation for a scientific method that gives justice to the voiceless, the forgotten, the ordinary. Their deaths, once hidden by tyranny, now give identity back to others lost in the chaos of history. Perhaps that's the strange poetry of science. It has no emotion, yet it brings closure. It cannot pray, yet it redeems. The more scientists studied the Romanov DNA, the more they began to uncover subtle genetic links that rippled through European history. Tsarina Alexandra, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, carried the same genetic mutation responsible for hemophilia that plagued several royal families across Europe. Through that single gene, researchers traced a medical lineage that stretched from the palaces of Britain to the courts of Spain and Germany. A quiet reminder that even empires can be undone by something as small as a molecule. The Romanovs' genetic story became a parable of how biology defies the illusions of power. Beneath crowns and titles, beneath myth and religion, the human body tells the same tale for everyone. We are fragile, we are mortal, and in the end, we are all written in the same biological language. As the Romanovs' remains were finally gathered together in their resting place, 7 coffins aligned under the golden domes of St. Petersburg, the questions their story raised lingered in the cold marble air. What is the value of truth if it brings pain? What is the purpose of knowledge if it destroys our illusions? Science had proven who they were, but the deeper mystery, why such a family and such an empire had to fall, still haunted the world. Because this story, in truth, isn't only about the Romanovs. It's about us, about the endless human desire to seek meaning through the ruins of history, about how we chase the ghosts of the past, hoping to find ourselves reflected in them. Every fragment of their bones, every strand of DNA told a story of human frailty, of faith, fear, love, and the limits of power. The Romanovs lived and died believing they were chosen by God. But in the end, it was science, not divine intervention, that preserved their memory and gave them back their names. And maybe that's the final lesson of the Romanov mystery, that truth, once found, demands courage to face it. The DNA analysis didn't just solve a crime, it exposed the tension between belief and knowledge, between what we wish were true and what actually is. In that sense, the Romanov case stands as one of the most profound intersections of history and science. It proved that the pursuit of truth, no matter how painful, can still bring peace, if only we're brave enough to accept it. A century later, the Romanov story continues to echo across generations. Their final resting place is quiet now, their names etched into marble, their story taught in classrooms and whispered in prayers. But through the lens of science, they have achieved a form of immortality, not in myth, but in fact. Their DNA endures as proof that even when empires crumble and legends fade, the truth written in our cells will always find a way to speak. So, as we close this chapter, perhaps the question isn't whether the Romanovs were found, but what their discovery means for us. How far are we willing to go to uncover the truth, even when it challenges our deepest beliefs? Because the story of the Romanovs reminds us that history never truly dies. It waits, patient and silent, in the dust and the dark, until science is ready to listen. And when it does, it speaks with a voice we can no longer ignore. If you found this story as powerful and haunting as we did, take a moment to reflect on how far we've come in our understanding of both science and ourselves. Don't forget to like this video, share it with others who love history and discovery, and subscribe for more stories where science meets the mysteries of the past and reveals the truth that time